The air inside the Vatican press hall was heavy, thick not with incense, but with anticipation, and something colder, fear. Not the fear of scandal. The church had weathered centuries of those. No, this was older, deeper. It was the kind of fear that settles in the lungs, when something sacred has shattered, and the pieces have not yet been swept away. The lights were harsh. Cameras had already been rolling for several minutes. The Pope, seated still and silent, had not spoken a word since entering the room. Cardinals flanked him like statues, unmoving. A row of journalists whispered among themselves. Nervous, impatient, certain this would be routine. It wasn't. At the center of the room stood a Vatican correspondent. Not young, but eager. He cleared his throat, deliberately loud, and raised his voice over the murmurs. "Your Holiness," he said, "can you tell us whether the reports concerning Father Matteo Balzano are accurate? We've heard the Diocese of Novara is in mourning. We've heard far worse." For one full breath, the world waited. The Pope did not glance toward his aides. He did not clear his throat or fumble with his notes. He simply looked up, slowly, deliberately, and spoke. "Yes," he said, with the weight of an entire church in his voice. "It's true." Those two words did not echo. They landed. Then, the final stone dropped. Father Matteo is gone. There was no cry, no gasp, just the absence of all sound, as if the room itself had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe. What had been rumor became reality. What had been whispered grief became public devastation. For months, there had been quiet talk of a beloved young priest who had disappeared from the public eye, of a town that grew still on Sunday mornings, of parish doors that remained unopened, of sermons never delivered. Now, there was confirmation from the highest moral voice on earth. And not just confirmation. There was sorrow, measured, barely restrained, and very real. It was the sorrow of a father, the sorrow of a shepherd, who had failed to bring one of his own lambs home. Pope Leo XIV had remained silent for weeks. Some said it was political. Others said it was cowardice. They were wrong. He had been silent because the grief was too sacred for the spectacle. Until now, until it had to be said aloud. That Father Matteo Balzano, ordained in joy and buried in silence, had died, not from illness, nor from accident, but from something darker, something lonelier. And as that truth filled the air, the reporters, some devout, many not, found themselves looking down, avoiding one another's eyes, unable to pretend they hadn't just heard. The soul of the church cracked open. This was not a press conference. This was a funeral. Now, comment below where you're watching from, because what you are about to hear is not just a story, it is a reckoning. And if your heart stirs, even slightly, and you still refuse to subscribe, perhaps ask yourself why it is easier to mourn in silence than to stand and be counted. He was born in the quiet town of Borgomanero, in the Piedmont region of northern Italy, on the 3rd day of January, 1990. A winter child, one whose cries were softer than most, as if even from birth, Matteo Balzano had entered the world listening before speaking. His mother, Lucia, had whispered over his crib that he would become a man of peace. His father had said little, but on the morning Matteo was baptized, he wept openly. He was raised among the orchards and chapels of Grignasco, a place where time slowed, and faith wasn't an act of public show, but a rhythm of life. The villagers remember a boy who volunteered to clean the altar, long before he understood what it meant. A boy who, even as others ran through fields, would stop at the cemetery wall just to speak a quiet prayer. Matteo Balzano was not brilliant in the academic sense. He was no scholar priest, no theological prodigy, but he was something rarer. He was kind. He listened with his whole face. He remembered people's names. He wept at funerals, not because he was weak, but because he believed it was sacred to share in the sorrow of others. And when he declared his desire to enter the priesthood, no one was surprised. He was ordained on June 10th, 2017, in the Cathedral of Novara, under the hand of Bishop Franco Giulio Brambilla. Witnesses say the bishop's hands trembled as they anointed Matteo. though no one could say whether it was from age or emotion. The people of Castelletto sopra Ticino welcomed him soon after, not as a stranger, but as a brother. For nearly 6 years, he served there, and not in grand cathedrals, not in papal chambers, or glittering basilicas, but in youth centers, in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms. His cassock often stained, his eyes often red-rimmed, from late nights and early vigils. He became known for one simple habit. He would kneel before giving advice, as if to remind himself that no counsel from man should be given without humility before God. In time, he was sent to the Marian shrine in Rhe, a place known for its silence, its solitude. Some say it was a reward. Others say it was an exile. No one really knew what happened there. But when he returned to public ministry, he was changed, not visibly, but inwardly. He smiled less. He spoke slower. His homilies became more personal, more aching. He would tell his parishioners, "Don't assume the person next to you is all right, just because they're singing the hymn." And when he was asked to take up the mission in Cannobio, especially its youth ministry, he accepted, not with enthusiasm, but with obedience. It was in Cannobio that the cracks began to show. He would disappear for hours at a time, sometimes whole days. He began quoting poets more than saints. And once, to a parishioner named Maria Grazia, he said something that now chills the bones. No one knows the hell one has inside until it makes itself known. He said it the week before he died. Pope Leo XIV knew of him, not personally, but deeply. He had read his letters, heard the stories, traced the outlines of a life that had burned quietly without ever asking for notice. And when the call came, that Father Matteo Balzano had not shown up to celebrate Sunday Mass, Leo's hand had already reached for the telephone before his secretary finished the sentence. That morning, July 6th, the Pope had closed his doors to all public meetings. For 24 hours, the leader of over 1 billion souls said nothing. And then he stepped into the press room and confirmed the one thing the Church was too afraid to say aloud: that one of its own had died, not of scandal, not of disease, but of despair. This was the setting: a press room suffocating under fluorescent lights, cameras blinking like mechanical eyes, reporters dressed for battle, not mourning. And in the center of it all, a pope who had built his reputation on silence, on withholding judgment, on waiting for the right moment to speak. But this time, he did not wait. This time, the silence would have been betrayal. They say Pope Leo XIV is a reformer, that he walks with the poor and sleeps only 5 hours a night, that he doesn't like titles, doesn't trust applause, and doesn't fear scandal. What he fears is forgetting men like Matteo, forgetting the quiet ones who carry too much, forgetting that even the most devout can drown. And so, he stood, not as a sovereign, not as a strategist, but as a father, one who had lost a son. Now you, watching this, hearing this, ask yourself, did his life mean something to you, even if you just learned his name today? If it did, then show the world that stories like his matter. Subscribe, because this is how silence ends. And if you won't subscribe, then at least have the courage to comment below why his life doesn't deserve to be remembered. A hand went up, sharp, rehearsed, confident. The journalist who raised it was no stranger to these rooms. Vatican credentials, dozens of press appearances. He had made a career out of asking questions that unsettled, questions designed to disarm. His tone was respectful, yes, but only in the way a surgeon's scalpel is sterile. It cuts clean, but it still cuts. "Your Holiness," he began, his voice perfectly pitched. "This is clearly a tragedy, but I must ask, why has the Vatican, under your leadership, failed to address the growing mental health crisis among priests?" A rustle moved through the room. Not outrage, but awareness. The question had been waiting beneath the surface, and now it had broken through. Pope Leo XIV did not blink. He did not reach for a script, nor glance toward an aide. Instead, he folded his hands on the table before him and exhaled, not out of weariness, but of measured control. When he spoke, his voice was low, resonant not with rhetoric, but with grief wrapped in discipline. "We mourn privately," he said, "until morning demands witness." There was no defensiveness in his tone, no evasion, only the echo of someone who had stood too long beside too many graves. The journalist followed quickly, sensing weakness, misunderstanding what he was hearing. "So, you're saying silence is your strategy? Is that not just avoiding accountability?" The room stiffened. This was the line, the one between inquiry and accusation. And he had crossed it. Pope Leo's gaze did not harden, but it deepened, like stone weathered by centuries of wind and fire. And then he answered, slowly, deliberately. "When a shepherd falls, the whole pasture mourns," he said, "but only the wolves celebrate." There was no applause, no murmurs of approval, only stillness. And yet, something shifted, because everyone understood what he had just done. He had answered the question, but not on the journalist's terms. He had refused the trap, not by denying it existed, but by stepping over it entirely. He had reminded the room that this was not about policy or damage control. It was about a soul, a real one who had once knelt at an altar and whispered words that had lit candles in the hearts of the weary. Father Matteo was not a case file, not a footnote. He was a man, a priest, a human life extinguished, not by scandal or crime, but by an ache no one had bothered to name. The journalist shifted in his seat. His pen, which had moved so swiftly only moments ago, now hung in the air, suspended by something heavier than uncertainty. It was discomfort, the kind that only truth can provoke. And here, beneath the marble ceiling of the Vatican's press room, with microphones humming and cameras blinking red, the line between news and mourning blurred, because suddenly the room was not just asking questions about policy. They were asking questions about themselves. Who listened to Matteo? Who noticed his silences? Who passed him by and assumed he was strong, simply because he was wearing a collar? You, watching this now, ask yourself the same thing. Would you have heard Father Matteo's silent suffering? Or would you have walked by? Subscribe. If you hear him now, still scrolling past, maybe share in the comments. What makes a story matter to you? Because if this one doesn't, then which one will? The journalist adjusted in his seat again. He no longer wielded the room as he had minutes before. His questions now emerged less from confidence, more from compulsion, as if something inside him needed to press further, if only to reassert the boundaries Pope Leo had quietly erased. Was Father Matteo abandoned by the Church? He asked, his voice steadier than his conviction. Did bureaucracy kill him? A murmur stirred, not from the reporters, but from somewhere deeper, unspoken, in the very stone of the room. Pope Leo did not flinch. He leaned forward, not to intimidate, but to shorten the distance between him and the weight of the question. He spoke, not defensively, nor with institutional polish, but with the weariness of someone who had carried that very question for longer than he had been allowed to say. He did not begin with an argument. He began with a confession. I received a letter from Father Matteo, he said. I did not open it until after he died. No gasp, no scandal, only the sound of breath slowing. He let the words sit, and then continued, not as a pope addressing the world, but as a man, reliving a private failure. In public light, it was handwritten, the ink faded in places, the edges softened. It had sat beneath a stack of correspondence for weeks. I told myself I would get to it when I had the time. I told myself it could wait. He paused. It couldn't. There was no need to elaborate. The weight was understood. The words in the letter, now infamous within the papal household, were few, but sharp. Matteo had written, Forgive me. I no longer know if what I feel is fatigue or failure. I only know that silence has begun to echo louder than prayer. And then, no one knows the hell one has inside until it spills into the daylight. Pope Leo placed a hand over his chest, not out of drama, but from a memory that still lived there. His voice, lower now, carried the gravity of the unspeakable. Matteo was not abandoned by the Church, he said, but he was alone within it. There was no rebuttal, because there was no defense. The loneliness of priesthood is not new, but is often denied. or worse, romanticized. The world prefers its priests, either flawless or fallen, saints or villains. It has little space for those who are simply human, exhausted, imperfect, breaking quietly behind locked sacristy doors. He spoke then of the countless priests who sit at hospital bedsides while their own hearts fracture, who bury strangers' children while grieving the loss of family they never had time to visit, who counsel couples through trauma while sleeping in rectories, too silent to bear. He did not name them. He did not need to, because every word carried the weight of the ones who hadn't yet written their letters, or the ones who had, and whose letters were still sitting, unread, beneath stacks of more urgent affairs. Then he turned the lens outward, not to accuse, but to reveal. This is not just about Matteo, he said. This is about a culture that asks its spiritual leaders to be symbols, not sons, that demands their presence, but denies their pain, that praises sacrifice, but pathologizes sorrow. He let that sit, let it sting, and then came the most damning truth. Not shouted, not forced, but released like incense, into air already saturated with grief. Matteo served everyone, but he did not believe he could be served in return. He gave his life away piece by piece, and when nothing remained, he believed that was holiness. It wasn't. It was depletion, and we, myself included, allowed it. There were no counter-questions now, no arguments, because this was not a debate. This was a reckoning. The bureaucracy had not killed Matteo with malice. It had killed him with neglect, with systems too slow, calendars too full, ears too deaf, to cries that didn't sound official enough. And so he was buried by silence. Not the silence of heaven, the silence of people who assumed someone else was listening. You, listening now, ask yourself, is silence enough? Should it be the final chapter in a life like his? Subscribe now. If you believe silence shouldn't be the end of anyone's story, but if you think this is just another tragedy, just another sad headline, then prove it. Tell us in the comments why silence is acceptable. Tell us why some souls deserve to vanish without a voice. It came quietly, but it cut deeper than anything said before. The journalist leaned forward again, not because the room had invited him, but because he could no longer resist the pull of the headline forming in his mind. There was something too open, too raw about the Pope's grief, and to him, that looked like an opportunity. He lowered his voice, as if softening it would soften the blade. "Your Holiness," he said, "with all respect, is this suicide not a symptom of your failed leadership?" The words didn't echo. They landed like iron on marble. Flat, heavy, undeniable. The room seemed to shrink. Lights, air, posture, everything drew inward, as if even the building itself knew. Something irreversible had just happened. Pope Leo did not respond immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes, not in frustration, not in prayer, in remembrance. And when he opened them again, his answer was not clever. It was not rehearsed. It was not even defensive. It was devastating. I failed to read the letter before it was too late. The sentence stood alone. No elaboration. No context. Just a wound, clean and deep. And then, slowly, without drama, the Pope reached for his ring. The fisherman's ring, centuries old, worn by the successors of St. Peter himself. He slid it off, the gesture heavy with meaning, and placed it flat, on the wood of the podium before him. There was no sound, but the soft click of metal against wood. The entire room seemed to lean forward, breath held, as he continued, not as an orator, not as a theologian, but as a man, stripped bare before the world. "I held his hands," he said, just hours after they found him. They were still warm, still imprinted, with the weight of prayer. He died with his fingers curled, as if gripping something invisible. Perhaps his last petition, or perhaps some hope that someone somewhere would finally hear what he had never said aloud. The silence was now total. Even the journalist looked away, and yet the Pope was not finished. His voice, steady but darkened by grief, pressed deeper into the wound. "You call it weakness," he said. "I call it martyrdom. In the age of noise, Matteo had not died because he was faithless. He had died because he had carried too much of everyone else's suffering and found no place to lay his own. He had spent his life pouring into empty rooms, answering calls that never came back, holding up those who never thought to ask if he needed to be held too. And when he could no longer stand, the world called it collapse. But Pope Leo called it crucifixion, not in the form of nails and wood, but in silence, in exhaustion, in the slow and lonely unraveling of a soul too generous for its own survival. The Pope's gaze scanned the room, not as a rebuke, but as an invitation, as if to say, "Do you see now? Do you see what it costs to be good in a world that notices only when goodness dies?" No one spoke, no one blinked, because in that moment, the press room had ceased to be a place of inquiry and had become a sanctuary of reckoning. There were no follow-up questions, no objections, only the weight of shared guilt, because the question was no longer whether the Pope had failed. The question was, how many of them, how many of us, had done the same? And you, still listening now, you who have followed this story into its darkest hour, ask yourself this: do you want to forget him? Do you want to walk away and let his name fade back into silence? Or will you mark this moment? Subscribe, not to follow a channel, but to remember a soul who lived for others and died unheard. Because if you're still watching, still feeling this, and you won't subscribe, then tell us why. Tell him why. Pope Leo did not raise his voice. He didn't need to, because when moral fire burns clean, it doesn't rage. It reveals. The journalist, now visibly shaken, had withdrawn into the safety of his silence. But silence, Pope Leo knew, could be a form of retreat or a form of surrender. And this was not the time for either. He turned not to the press corps, but to the cameras, to the ones watching from afar, the believers and the skeptics, the defenders and the doubters, the quiet souls with open screens and guarded hearts. "You confuse suicide with sin," he said, his tone like the toll of a bell. Slow, unblinking, sacred. And we confuse silence with peace. We must stop both. The room did not move, because it was not a statement. It was a mirror to every policymaker who had reduced pain to pathology, to every parishioner who assumed a calm priest was a whole priest, to every institution that had built protocols but forgotten presence. Then the Pope told the story no one had expected him to tell. Matteo's final Mass. It was just 4 days before his death. He had walked into the chapel in Cannobio, as he always did, simple stole, worn cassock, hands clasped so tightly. It looked as if he was holding something. Only he could see. Witnesses remembered his homily. It was not long. It was not dramatic. He had said, "You can pour yourself out for others your whole life, but unless someone fills you in return, the vessel breaks." He had spoken it calmly, with a strange kind of stillness. Then he served communion, offering the body of Christ, with a look not of detachment, but of deep farewell. No one noticed then, but they remembered later. After the Mass, he had stayed behind, hours, kneeling alone in the front pew, not praying aloud, not moving, just breathing, as if trying to inhale something he had once known, but had slowly lost. Afterward, he asked for a few days of retreat. He returned to the Marian shrine in Rhe, a place wrapped in silence and stone, in ritual and memory. The shrine had seen miracles, but this time, it received a man on the brink. No one knows what happened there in those last quiet days, but his journal was found, pages torn and folded. One line had been underlined twice. "I do not want to die. I want to stop disappearing." And that was the line that shattered the last of a distance. Between Pope and press, between headline and human soul, he stepped back from the podium, only slightly, and looked at the man who had asked whether this death was his failure. Then came a question that cut deeper than any accusation before it. "Why," he asked gently, "does defending broken shepherds make you uncomfortable?" No one answered, because that question was not meant for one journalist. It was meant for all of us. Why are we quick to mourn when a figure falls, but slow to act when one begins to crumble? Why are we more comfortable condemning weakness, then holding it. Why do we quote doctrine louder? Then we practice mercy? Pope Leo XIV did not deliver a rebuke. He delivered a revelation. That Father Matteo's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror, and in it, the Church saw its failure to hold its own with tenderness. The world saw its addiction to scandal over sorrow, and every viewer saw a truth they had once tried to ignore, that even those who live closest to the altar can die furthest from hope. This is what Holy Shadows is about, shedding light on the unseen, the tragic, the holy, the quiet martyrs of our time, the souls who serve until they are spent and vanish without monuments. If that matters to you, if even part of your heart stirred during this story, then subscribe, not for numbers, not for views, but for memory, to say someone saw him, someone listened. And if you're still here, still moved, and you don't subscribe, then comment what's stopping you. Comment why someone like Matteo should be forgotten, why this death should pass like wind over stone. Because if you can't, maybe it's time you stayed. Pope Leo XIV stood still for a long moment, not in triumph, but in the quiet gravity of a man who had opened his soul, not to defend himself, not to protect an institution, but to resurrect a forgotten brother from beneath the rubble of polite neglect. And then, slowly, his gaze turned, not to the reporters seated before him, but to the camera lens watching in silence, to the millions of unseen faces behind screens, scattered across cities and villages, parishes and apartments. He was no longer speaking to journalists. He was speaking to you. This isn't about the press, he said, and it's not about me. It's about Father Matteo. A pause, his voice steady, and the thousands like him. You could feel it, the shift, the unspoken weight, moving from the Vatican press room into living rooms and bedrooms, and back seats and cafes, wherever someone had stopped scrolling, long enough to watch, to feel, to grieve. It is easy to hold vigils for the fallen, he continued, but that is not how we honor the ones we lose. We don't honor him by mourning. We honor him by listening, by becoming what he needed, before it was too late for someone else. There was no priestly polish now, just truth, worn, weathered, real. We need a church, he said, that can cry without shame and love without fear. A church that makes room not only for saints, but for the exhausted, the doubting, the disappearing. He stepped back from the podium, not in withdrawal, but in offering. This story, this pain, is not just about Matteo Balzano. It is about what kind of world we are building, whether we are creating a faith that saves the soul, or a system that forgets it exists. Then the words that would remain, long after the lights dimmed. God didn't forget him, Pope Leo said. We did, but now we remember. You watching, wherever you are, however distant you feel. This moment is not about grief alone. It is about redemption, the kind that does not erase what happened, but demands that it matter. You don't need to be a theologian to feel this. You don't need to be Catholic. You only need to be human. And if your heart stirred, if your breath caught, if just once you thought, someone should have done more, then let that someone be you now. If Father Matteo's story deserves a voice, then let it be yours. Subscribe, share, cry, speak. Let his silence become a call. Let his death make space for someone else's survival. But if you're still here, still watching, and you don't subscribe, then don't vanish like you did. Don't be quiet. Comment why you won't help his voice be heard. Because silence is what lost him. But remembrance might save the next. What would you have said if you were in that room? Not as a journalist, not as a skeptic or believer, just as a human being, witnessing the weight of sorrow, laid bare beneath the vaulted ceiling of power and faith. Would you have spoken? Would you have dared to ask the Pope if it was his fault? Would you have looked into the face of that loss, Matteo's loss, and asked, what should we have done differently? Or would you have stayed silent? Let the moment pass? Now, long after the press room emptied, long after the microphones clicked off, and the cameras dimmed, the echo of Pope Leo's final confession still lingers. It lingers in the breath between questions, in the silence that follows funerals, in the space between someone's suffering, and our willingness to see it. So what do you think? Did the church fail him? Or do we all share the blame? Was Matteo alone? Because no one saw him? Or because we trained ourselves not to look? These questions don't belong in news cycles. They belong in hearts. And hearts, like altars, are only sacred when they are opened. This is Holy Shadows, not a channel for noise, or outrage, or spectacle, but a space for truth. In its most vulnerable form, a space for those who lived quietly and were forgotten loudly, a space for those who served and disappeared. May we all seek truth with humble hearts and never let silence speak louder than compassion. If you felt anything watching this, grief, anger, recognition, shame, then don't let that feeling drift into forgetfulness. Subscribe, not for us, for the ones you won't hear anywhere else.